Hello, everybody. We'll get started in a minute. Okay, let's get started. Hello, everybody. This is Hyana Park from Spy Palm Partners. I am the project manager for this webinar series that's sponsored by Federal Highways and AASHTO. Welcome to webinar 31 in our Transportation Asset Management webinar series. The topic of today's webinar is the AASHTO Transportation Asset Management Guide. I'm guessing that most of you have seen the existing guide, the volume 2, but today what we'll be discussing is the work on volume 3, which is in the midst of development. We've presented webinars in this series every 2 months going back to 2012 on a variety of topics regarding asset management. For more information on this webinar series, please visit tam-portal.com. That's tam-portal.com. From there, click TAM Events in the main menu to register for any webinar. You'll also find archives of previous webinars and links to video and slides from today's webinar will be posted on the site. This is the new home of the AASHTO Subcommittee on Asset Management. For information on the subcommittee, you can find that also on the TAM portal in the About part of the menu and click on Subcommittee on Asset Management. If you have any suggestions on future webinars or have questions for the presenters today, as well as there are going to be parts where we ask you questions, please submit your comments using the webinar's Q&A feature that you'll see in the main kind of menu of the Citrix webinar tool. So we'll have Q&As throughout today's webinar and have an open Q&A at the end if we need further dialogue about the guide. Throughout the webinar, the audience will be muted by default and only the presenter will be audible. So we'll use the mute button to make sure that when we're not needed to be heard, we will not cause distractions. So that covers the logistics for today's webinar. So I'd like to say a few words of welcome on behalf of Steve Gay of Federal Highways. So Federal Highways and Federal Highways Asset Management Team are proud sponsors of these webinars in cooperation with AASHTO Subcommittee on Asset Management. And I'd like to welcome all of you to join today on behalf of Federal Highways that funds this webinar series. We've covered many topics over the course of these webinars. With today's topic, the TAM Guide 3, we're changing up the format a bit. Today's webinar will feature an interactive session where we'll be looking to you for your input. We'll be discussing the plans for the development of the next volume of the AASHTO TAM Guide, which is right now called TAM Guide Volume 3. More information on the existing volumes of the guide is available online at the URLs that are on the screen. For this webinar, the primary learning objective reflects our more interactive format. We want to introduce you to many of the key concepts and definitions and to the framework that structures the TAM guide. But most importantly, today we want to learn from you and to share lessons learned, ideas, and knowledge. For today's agenda, Francis Harrison and I will lead the presentations and the interactive sessions, and we'll have a final open Q&A at the end. So just another reminder that throughout today's webinar, if you have a comment or a question, please use the webinar's Q&A feature at any time during this presentation. And in response to the most frequently asked question, yes, we'll make the slides and video available after today's webinar at the TAM portal that I explained before. So with that, let's get started. So we're in the midst of a project to develop the next TAM guide. And so this now will be TAM Guide 3. The first version of the guide was finished in the early 2000s. The next version was finished in around 2000, I think, and 10 or 2008 or so. Anyways, and so this is about almost 10 years from when the last guide was developed. And so times, as you know, have changed, and the AASHTO, in coordination with both the AASHTO subcommittee and the TRB Committee on Asset Management, developed the scope of the next guide. It's being implemented in phases, and we've just completed phase 1, where the purpose of that phase was to assess the effectiveness of the current guide and then to develop strategies and actions to improve the guide's effectiveness and think about how we can present the guide in a form that's well suited to future updating. And then we also, in phase 1, looked at capturing approaches and practices that promote success in implementing asset management and identified barriers that agencies are facing and determining how the guide can help remove those barriers. In the next phase, which is the one that's just starting up, so this is a really excellent time to get your input. So the next phase is focused on actually producing the guide, and there will be both a paper version, or kind of imagine a PDF version of the guide, as well as a web version of the guide to make it easier for you to get to the content. So, the focus of this new guide will be to make sure that it best meets the current needs of the user community now and also into the near-term future. We want to, in this guide, recognize the availability of content that's around in other research products as well as practice products, and those being developed through the federal agencies and other TRB projects, as well as international documents. We want to recognize they exist, but that this document can stand on its own without having to go to these other documents as references. The other objective of this phase is to include elements of practice as much as possible, so that the reader of or the consumer of the guide will be able to get models of what the concepts are. I think that was one of the feedback that came from the user community. We want to make the guide as easy to use as possible with nuggets of information. A big feedback we received in phase 1 was that the information that was presented in the volume 2 guide is that it was too dense, very hard to absorb because of the density of content. And then we will, of course, take advantage of the digital environment and the opportunities for greater access and levels of information depending on how much you want at a given time. So just to give an overview of the schedule and where we are, we're just starting with phase 2 here, and you can see that the first product you'll see will be the paper product, and the target is to be done with that by next March of 2019, and then have the digital guide available in July of 2019. You will see products along the way, and depending on the panel's wishes, it may be possible that you'll see chapters as they're produced. And you can see in the bottom portion of the schedule that there are going to be community of interest engagement opportunity to get feedback along the way as the guide is being developed. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Frances Harrison, who's going to walk us through the guide outline.
Hello, everybody. So what you see here is an overview of the sections of the guide. Before I go through that, I just wanted to walk through some of the design principles that we established in order to come up with the guide organization. So first, we wanted to provide a modular structure that would make it easy for someone to find guidance on a topic of interest, as opposed to needing to read this cover to cover. And we wanted each of the substantive chapters to stand alone. We wanted to be able to cover the fundamental concepts of asset management, as well as concrete implementation activities that are associated with those concepts, really making this practical. Next, we wanted to make sure we covered activities that are needed to meet the current federal requirements for TAMP development, but we wanted to provide a much broader framework that goes beyond those requirements, recognizing that they may evolve. We wanted to reflect a plan, do, check, act cycle of activities, and that's fundamental to some of the international asset management standards. We wanted to communicate both the why and the how for key asset management activities. And we wanted to focus on general asset management techniques, but also recognize that different assets require different approaches. So there won't be chapters for different assets. There'll be chapters for these techniques, but within the text, we want to make sure that we cover the fact that approach for pavement is very different from approach for a traffic signal or a sign. And then finally, and importantly, we want to make this document a resource to agencies that has varying approaches to asset management, recognizing that there's no single correct way of doing things. And that's some of the challenge that we recognize in writing this, so that it's not a Bible on how the one way one should do things, but making sure that we reinforce some important principles on how to go about this, and then talk about the variation and how you do it. how you might do it in different situations. Okay, so with that as background, this is the, can you go back to the previous slide on the overall content? There you go. This is the overall organization of the guide. We looked at a number of different existing asset management frameworks and coming up with this. It's heavily based on the Institute of Asset Management anatomy document, and also we looked at the PAS 55 and the ISO 55001 framework. We did update the topic lists and changed around some of the content to fit the U.S. situation. So you can kind of see that bookmarking the four processes in the middle are organization and people, which is so important to asset management, and information systems on the right. So those are kind of enabling capabilities. And then the four activities in the middle are more or less sequential or important topics to be covered. Strategy and planning, that's kind of where to begin, setting the vision and developing plans and processes, and then moving down to approaches for maximizing the life of transportation assets, and then monitoring and adjustment, and resource allocation. There's a lot of feedback loops across these activities, and let me cover each one of the sections sequentially. So next slide. Okay, so in the strategy and planning, we're in that middle quadrant here. Strategy and planning, so we'll start off by covering just the basics on establishing a vision, goals, and strategy for transportation asset management in your agency, how you establish a common understanding of what it is, and link it to agency goals, vision, mission, and strategies. That connection or line of sight between asset management and the agency's overall picture will be discussed there. The second topic will be asset management integration, and that will point out all of the different important linkages within a DOT for asset management, since asset management is fundamentally an integrating type of practice. Next, we'll talk about how to scope and structure a transportation asset management program or function in your agency. So that will cover options for incremental implementation. We'll talk about how you go about setting up a structure to set goals and provide a foundation for data gathering and also communication based on what the linkages are that you've established. We'll have a section there on developing a transportation asset management plan and talk about its role overall in the process. And then there will be the last part of that section. We'll talk about establishing a continuous improvement process for transportation asset management. So that's kind of the high-level picture at the strategy level, where it fits in your organization. Next slide. Okay, moving to organization and people, one of the supporting capabilities. This will talk about how to establish roles for transportation asset management in your agency. What are the responsibilities? What are the associated competencies? What are the options and approaches for identifying a home for transportation asset management, where it should live in your organization? Because as we know, that varies considerably across agencies. The second topic will cover coordination and communication and the specific types of channels that are important to establish, not only within the organization, but with external partners. And then the third section there is about managing change. Change management is a very general topic, but this will specifically talk about change management needs with respect to asset management, because implementing a new kind of integrating capability like asset management in an agency does require changes in roles and communication and responsibilities. So this will be kind of a section on change management as applied to asset management implementation. Next. Okay, so we're moving into the approaches for maximizing the life of transportation assets. We used to call this life cycle management in an earlier draft, but we thought this was a little bit more plain English. So this will start getting into some more substantive technical material here. We'll talk about different life cycle management approaches, and here's where we're going to detail different assets and different approaches to life cycle management. And then we'll move on to just discussing the basics of how do you define asset service and condition levels, and how would you define minimum standards for those levels. Once we've defined those service and condition levels, we'll talk about asset life and performance. So how do you look at the life of your asset and figure out what treatments or what sequence of treatments you need to plan for over the entire life cycle. And then we'll have a section on life cycle planning and analysis, and that will talk about kind of some of the analytical techniques or how you go about approaching, figuring out what the sequence of treatment should be, and how do you model that, and with different levels of sophistication for different assets. And then we'll talk about network optimization. And so in some cases, there will be optimization techniques. Certainly in the pavement management area, that's probably the furthest advanced in terms of what's the optimal state of the network and how do you move towards that target. And then finally, we'll talk about work packaging and delivery, which will bring kind of the reality of the fact that you're delivering all of these treatments and projects that may be packaged with other kinds of treatments, either within a corridor or on the asset itself. And so what's the relationship between planning the work and developing your life cycle management strategy. Next. Okay, so we've talked about the kinds of work that you need to plan across the life cycle and how to optimize. This section will talk about allocating resources. So this is kind of getting back to the top-down processes for taking a budget and splitting it either within an asset category by district or by type of asset, or type of road system, or doing cross-asset allocation. So we'll talk about different allocation processes and also different prioritization processes. Talk about those approaches, cover how to account for uncertainty in some of those processes. And then we'll talk about investment versus performance analysis, the various tools and methods to analyze what will the impacts be of a certain budget allocation across assets or within an asset category. And we'll relate that to target setting, since that's, for those of you that have just submitted your asset management plans, you know that that's a big part of the analysis, is setting a target and doing analysis to see whether that target is reasonable given your investment strategy. We'll have a section specifically on cross-asset investment analysis. This one is a maturing practice, and there are several techniques and tools out there on how do you allocate resources in this multi-objective framework. There will be a section on target setting and different approaches, and that will reference some of the current federal requirements, certainly, and other available resource documents. And then finally, a section on financial planning and how that has to sync up with, obviously, the resource allocation and target setting. And I should mention here and just reinforce what Jana said at the beginning, that we're not intending to rewrite existing guidance and research material here. I look at this guide as really encapsulating the key nuggets of what you need to know about all of these and pointing you to existing references that already provide more detail on how to do all of this stuff. Next. So monitoring and adjustment is fundamental practice within asset management. It's that plan, do, check, act cycle. So this chapter will start off with a brief discussion of performance management, measurement and management, and talk about key performance measures and how they are used with the specific asset management application. And then it will talk about monitoring the state of the assets. And this chapter won't get into information technology or systems or data management, but it will talk about what are the needs, what are the information needs you want to monitor, what kinds of information should you consider gathering, and how do you decide what information is enough to suit your purposes. So that's what that monitoring the state of the assets will look at, not how you collect the data, but what data you should be gathering. It will also cover asset valuation approaches in there as well. And then the third section here will talk about a different type of monitoring, which is monitoring what you're spending and what your revenue situation is, looking at trends and what you've been spending your funding on, and using that trend information just to provide a useful context for your future planning. And we'll also, in this chapter, talk about how you monitor asset work. So how many miles or lane miles are you paving? What are you doing for your signs? What work are you actually doing? And how does that translate into performance? So how can you use or tap into information in your organization about what work you're doing, what it's costing, and how you can use that information to help improve some of your planning assumptions and models about if you do a certain treatment, what does it cost and how effective it will be. Next, there will be a section on tracking and managing risks, and it will talk about how you can integrate some of that information on risk into your decision-making processes. And finally, there'll be a section on monitoring of process improvements. So that initial strategy and planning chapter set the framework for transportation asset management as a continuous improvement process. This will talk about tracking those improvements to make sure that they're getting done and that you're making progress. Next. So this final section on information and systems this will cover the, how are you getting the data, how are you storing it, how are you using it and analyzing it. The concept of civil integrated management and building information management are kind of growing, and those concepts talk about a very integrated life cycle view of information around managing assets and a kind of electronic flow of information across the life cycle. So we'll cover that and we'll give some examples of practice in that area. We'll cover data governance and management and the whole set of strategies that are so important to make sure that you can do all of that monitoring that we talked about in the prior chapter, that all the information fits together, and that there's no duplication or minimal duplication, and that you're ensuring access to that information to people that need it, both within and outside the organization. There will be a section on asset data collection, and that will be covering both traditional as well as some of the newer approaches to data acquisition and some of the new technologies that are out there, and also some of the data sources that are out there. And then a section on asset management systems, both the traditional ones for pavement and bridge, but also it will talk about other ancillary asset management systems and how to ensure integration with other systems for work tracking, project programming, trade-offs, financial, maintenance, etc. in the system, how to think about all of those systems in a modular way, sharing information across. There will be a section on integrating asset, work, and financial data. That's covered in the other chapters in terms of what the needs are, but this one will talk about the realities of how do you actually get that data integrated, what kinds of standards might you use, and how, what kinds of integration technologies and approaches might you use in order to accomplish that. And last but not least, there will be a section on asset data reporting and visualization, and that will provide some examples and techniques for telling the story of asset management through effective visualizations, useful reports tailored to different audiences, and that will also talk about how to share information effectively through APIs and other kind of open data methods. So I think that brings us to the end of the chapter. So I just talked for a while and covered a lot of material. So now I'd like to give you guys a chance to give us feedback on, are we on track? Does this seem like a good organization? Are there some concepts that we missed? Are there questions that you have? So I don't know, Perry, if you want to give instructions for the folks. Seems pretty straightforward to just type the question or comment.
Sure, that's it, Francis. If you can just type in any questions in the webinar question panel, we'll answer them as they come up.
So what we'd like to see is just, as Francis went through the content, was there something that you were expecting to see that wasn't covered? Since this is fairly real time, if you want to digest it further after Perry puts up the slides, you'll see the outline in that. You can also just send us an email or send Matt an email just stating TAM Guide 3 comments, and then it'll come back. So so just a comment from Karen Miller saying appears very comprehensive and likes that it goes beyond the Federal Highway TAMP guidance and has paper and digital both. All right, I think what we'll do is we'll keep going, and if you have thoughts, please just type it in, and we'll respond to it either along the way or definitely at the end of the webinar. All right, let's move to the next slide. Thank you, Francis, for that.
Thanks, everybody.
Great description. In phase one, which is the part that's been done, really what we were doing was designing the guide, designing the kind of the delivery vision for the guide, as well as some of the ways that we're communicating the content. Because when we did, at the beginning of phase one, we did a survey, and the number one feedback was people wanted more accessible information. They wanted it to be easily kind of viewable, and that they're provided in multiple ways, as well as in digestible bite-sized chunks, I think was a big feedback. So some of you may have seen this diagram, or a diagram that looks like this. It's analogous to the Federal Highways TPM Technical Assistance Program, but we thought it provided a good model for how we think about the TAM guide and how the content will be delivered. So first and foremost, one of the more challenging parts of phase one was, what is the way that we want to organize the content? Because as many of you have seen through, if you looked at the IIMM, that's out of New Zealand, that's the International Infrastructure Management Manual, or the IAM, Institute of Asset Management Anatomy. There are multiple ways to look at asset management and ways to organize asset management, and it really will depend on what aspect of asset management you care about. So we needed to come up with a way to organize it that is general enough that it accommodates as many of the different audience wants as possible. And so that's what Francis just presented in the framework. And so that is going to be a unifying organizational element in the guide. It's the way we're designing the chapters. But we want to carry that over into the web, the digital version, where there'll be a website. It'll be linked and accessible from the TAM portal that AASHTO is hosting, and you'll be able to download pieces of the content, and you would be able to access the information from, for instance, tablets as well as phones. And so you see in the guidebook itself, you'll be able to get it both in PDF and HTML. And then we want it to be connected to the resources that are in the curated kind of library that is on the TAM guide as well, that for those documents, a federal highway guidance on lifecycle management, that there will be a pointer in the digital version to the relevant pieces. And because it's digital, we'll be able to add future links to future relevant resources. So that's the vision in terms of how this would all work in the future. And so in order for all of this to be able to work, we really have to design it up front so that it accommodates those various specifications. Next. All right, so let's go into some of the pieces. So Francis went over how the content is getting organized, but interwoven throughout the content will be elements that help to guide you in ways that makes it easier to access the guidance. So for instance, case studies and examples. The feedback we've gotten from the panel is, maybe more, again, the more bite-sized practice examples may be more relevant. How-to guides and checklists, and I'm gonna go over some examples of it, but again, we're thinking that on key topics, that we would have a 4-page how-to guide that you can just kind of pull out and look at. And it's a way to get started on getting engaged in that aspect of asset management, and a checklist that would take you through, did you do this? Did you do this? As part of integrating that aspect into your TAM program. definitely a lot of graphs and charts, as much visualization as possible, a lot of images, database or GIS generated information, so on a web, that you may be able to connect some of the visuals that are coming from a set of data and then be able to access the source information and download it. Where it's possible, we're going to explore the integration of 3D models and definitely trying to integrate on the digital version the use of videos to communicate content. So let me walk through some of these pieces. So on the case studies and examples, we're talking about short case studies, practice vignettes, and they'll be sprinkled throughout. I don't know if you remember in the TAM Guide 2, we do have case studies or kind of vignettes of practice. Some of it is actually kind of made up ones that articulate a situation that agencies would have. But in the end, there were, I think, 3 more in-depth case studies. And so part of the feedback from the panel has been that the case studies may be better to have it be short. And so the other is, can we think of more efficient ways to collect case studies? And so one of the things that the TAM portal has now is a section of if you come up on the front page of the tam.portal.com, you'll see a yellow band, and you'll actually be able to submit a good practice. And if you do that and you don't really want to write anything much, just putting the general information of what it is allows us to follow up with you and write that up. If you have a document that describes it, you can upload it. So this gives it, I think it will allow us to have broader reach, to have this kind of crowdsourced approach. And we hope that you all who are on the call will be able to share with us some of your practices. We also intend to gather content from presentations at the TRB TAM meeting that's happening in San Diego. It's a very kind of timely point in the development of the guide content. So we'll be going to sessions and documenting what people are talking about, and that I think will help us well too. And then the research team members have a fairly broad and diverse reach into the community, and that will also help us. Next. So on this one, Perry's probably going to have to explain how you give us our feedback, but in your opinion, what types of case studies and examples are most useful? So an in-depth case study, kind of, like a more than 10 pages where you really get into the topic, a short description of a specific practice that's, let's say less than 2 pages, or an example that includes a resource that can be a model for others to use. So for instance, that includes an actual manual or a communication component or a spreadsheet or visualization. We're just curious. I think all of these will have multiple types of cases, but we were curious what you all felt in terms of what would be the most valuable to you.
Yep, and so the poll's up on your screen now, hopefully, and you can just select one or more of the options and submit your answers. We'll be able to review them after the poll's closed. And we'll just give a minute for that.
Yeah, I think it would be better if you picked one, since there are only. And if you have another idea of a way you want kind of real examples, just click on the other and put it into the Q&A, the questions model, and just type in your answer.
Okay, we're still getting answers.
Yeah. So the answers are coming in right now. The short descriptions of specific practices ahead, but we're seeing it's clear that the 10-page or more is not, but the other two are kind of close. Yeah, I think I would have expected that, although it would have been interesting to see what would have been seen as more valuable.
Yeah, and so we'll close it up now and share the results.
All right, so you can see here, the short descriptions, less than 2 pages, got 67%, and kind of the example resource with a model got 50%, and in-depth case studies got 22. So some people, I guess, voted more than once, which is fine. All right, thank you all. Let's go back and continue. So you'll be getting a couple more of these questions along the way. We're getting one right away. So in terms of when you do a case or a practice example, there are usually examples from specific organizations. And so if you could list your top, 1 or 2, but no more than 2. So if you're a highway agency, when I say other modes, you're curious about how asset management is done in a different mode. So Pyrrhic agency is the first choice there. Other modes, international agencies, other public sector. So for instance, water or a building agency, utilities, and then the last choice in terms of a specific type would be a commercial sector, private sector kind of organization, maybe a real estate company, other types of organizations that are on the private sector side that might have relevance. And then you can also type in other. So here we will open up the poll. So it's clear the Pyrrhic agency, that's probably the first choice of almost everybody. And then it's looking like the other public sector might be.
Okay, we can close that one and share the results.
All right. So you can see, so the other public sector is really, the Pyrrhic agency for sure, and then the other public sector is a clear favorite. Good. All right. So let's move on to the how-to guides and checklists. So the how-to guide we see as kind of a structured way to provide step-by-step descriptions of the process that will provide you with enough detail to gain a basic understanding of that topic area. And then sometimes you would have a checklist associated with a how-to guide, but we can see them working independently as well, where a checklist is more of a list where it's to trigger in you, have you done the following recommended practices. So, so based on the feedback we've gotten from the surveying and working with a community of interest, we recommend the development of these how-to and checklists to reinforce existing knowledge. So they would be, it's not a replacement to the content that will be in the guide, be able to be used to get up to speed quickly. And then if there are specific technical requirements related to it, they will be noted in the guide. And then the checklist also can be a way to verify that the good practices are in place at your agency. So going to the next slide that just shows an example of, so working with us on this project are Applied Pavement, Katie Zimmerman and Brad Allen from Applied Pavement Technology, and also Royce Greaves and Martin Gordon from Opus, and they've recently been purchased by WSP. So, so Katie and Brad have worked on these examples. This is one on life cycle planning and pavements. So you can see how at the first part, it gives you a high-level view of what is life cycle planning, and then it goes into the steps. You can go to the next. And so you can see on the left page there, goes through the steps. So it's easy to kind of to see what it is you should do, and then a final page that presents what you would get as a result of doing good life cycle planning. So you can see the structure would be to use something to make this a kind of a generic structure that gets applied, so that if you're the user of the guide, you have a framework that gets kind of embedded in the way you look at information. Next. And then here's a checklist that basically would take, you know, elements and then allow you to go through and say, you know, here are good practices. Is it something you're doing yourself? All right. So there's a whole lot of topics, and there's limited budget, so we probably won't be able to do every single how-tos that would be good to have, but it doesn't mean down the road more cannot be added. But we would love your input on what would be the most valuable to you. So you can see here's a list of the initial set of how-tos that we're considering including, and if you could just go through and pick your top 3.
Well, in fact, in this case, we're going to have the list divided into 3 parts, and so each time we present the list, you can pick one of the options or 2, and we're going to try to move through them quickly because there's 3 separate polls to share here.
Yeah, so if you could just pick one out of this set here, not because Perry's going to do 2 more slides. We'll just go through one at a time, and you'll pick. This is working within the confines of this web tool. All right. And then the results will pop up.
I'm going to...
No? Oh, you were going to keep going.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we'll step back and go through the results.
Okay. So here's the second set of topics. So if you could pick one out of this set on the how-to guides. So this is the third time we're doing this kind of polling, and it's always fascinating to see which ones come up. And some of them are consistent, and that's really what we want to see, and that will help us. So here's the last one. So out of these four, well, it's really three, unless you want to add one yourself that you haven't seen that you would really like to have as a how-to guide, then pick the other and then use the Q&A feature to add your suggestion. All right, so this is the first set, very clear priority in terms of how to perform life cycle planning, and then followed by how to select a strategy for managing non-pavement bridge assets. And then the next one, so clear favorite to how to evaluate cross-asset trade-offs. And then the next would be how to estimate asset life. And then on the last one, how to determine needed data and best collection methods, followed by conducting a performance gap analysis. And so I think it makes sense that a lot of the priorities we're seeing in these polls is that these are the less mature areas of asset management practice, so people want to know how to get assistance on how to do them. All right, next. So, this is just an example of visualizations that we hope to have embedded in the guide so that you get ideas and models of how to present information tied to concepts that are being described. So here's an example funding flow diagram that the New Hampshire DOT has, and it goes from where the sources of funding are to how it's being distributed to different programs. So I think this visualization is very interesting and takes a minute to orient, but then very shows things that it would be harder to see just in numerical form. Here's an image example of pavement condition metrics and how different, kind of illustrating how pavement condition is measured. So when we're talking about pavement performance management, a visual like this will be an aid to communicating the concept rather than just the list of words. Next. And then here's an example from the Oregon Department of Transportation, which shows the locations of electrical chargers throughout the state or at the eastern part of the state. But it's showing information, and one of the thoughts we had was, could we incorporate in the digital portion? So the paper version would show the diagram, and that would be valuable, but maybe there's a way to click on it in the digital version, and you could have more a base that you can use as a user if you're using, let's say, a certain GIS tool set, for instance. All right. And then here's an example of the use of 3D model visualization. So This is something we haven't tested out yet, but we were imagining if we could, show it in the photo kind of way here, but more interestingly, on the digital side, could you click on a 3D visualization and use your mouse to click around to look under and over a bridge, and you can get a perspective of the 3D spatial element of what we're trying to communicate. Next. And then the idea of having videos, I know that now whenever I need to do something that I don't know how to do, I feel like I end up on YouTube, whether it is to fix the way my calendaring is working, or I have a pain in my neck, and is there something I can do? And we know that my kids are in college and they seem to look at a lot of videos, and so the notion that we integrate into the digital version a set of videos that communicates the content and also would be viewable from your smartphone, so that maybe there's a series that, hey, if you have a minute and you're sitting on a train, you can view it, or you're out in the field and you need a quick instruction, it may communicate that better to you. All right, so there was a question, because this was one of the areas that there was some differences of opinion on how valuable videos are to learning. And so we wanted to hear from you, how important is it that videos are included in the digital version of the guide? So Perry will open the poll. So you'll pick just one of those choices, and let's see where we land. Well, fairly even distribution. Okay. We can watch the tallying in real time. So we get important, 44%, and then very and do not care kind of evenly, but this poll definitely skews important. I think one of the polls we had in a previous outreach venue had the important one not as being the least. So I think we're guessing there's a little bit of correlation with age, that the younger folks tend to. So everyone on the call, you're considered younger folks here. So, all right, let's move on. All right, so this is another kind of open question that you should use the Q&A feature of the webinar tool. So what are other ways that you think that this guide should present content? Is there something that I haven't mentioned that you want to make sure that the research team considers in how content is presented? So we'll see if some responses come now. If not, we'll just all right, I think it's probably better, Perry, to keep going. So the other thing I wanted to share with you was how we're integrating available resources. So we collected over 120 resources during phase 1, and we organized the resources, kind of tag the resources in terms of the maturity as it relates to current thinking around TAM, as well as how relevant is this resource going to be in terms of the TAM Guide 3 effort. So you can see that a lot of it is high maturity, high relevance, but some elements were dropped, but not many. Then moving on. So then we further organized it into comprehensive guidance, the ones that kind of cut across topic areas versus those specific things that look at something as specific as LiDAR for data efficiency or big data, and data governance. So we organized into those types of guidance, and we imagine that we will feature some of these things that we feel are important, and we want the user of this guide to be able to get to other resources, but you don't have to, but it's available to you. The other thing we're doing on the integration is we're going through now and taking the chapter outline that Francis presented to you. It's, we have it in slightly more detail than that already, and then mapping which existing resource should be something we should look at and consider as we're writing the content for this guide, and where we have to choose to summarize the topic, but maybe make a reference to, if you want more detail, you can go there. So in terms of the design approach for the guide, we're going to have a print format, so we're going to organize it in a digestible way, and we also want to have very good navigation markers so you can move around the guide in the paper form easily, and then have a lot of visual aids to increase understanding of the content, meaning not just all words. And then we want to strategically use white space to help our eyes absorb the information. So here we have some production templates that Perry's worked on. So here you'll see that the final products we're imagining, and I'll say, this is probably going to evolve as we get into the content, but it helps all of us who are authoring the content to know what are we moving towards, so that we're collecting the pieces of information that's relevant. But you can see here at the top, you have a way to communicate in the two-bar way. You have columns, which can be used for text as well as visuals. And you can see on the right kind of a highlights feature where things are placed there to make it pop out. So this is the general. And then here's kind of a mock-up using just text letters. And you can see how it might look if it's just a text view. You can also use this to feature certain call-out boxes here. And you can see here in the top the document navigation. And Perry's designed it so that on the paper view, as well as so that it can transition very easily to the digital version with the navigation at the top with clickable, but also can be used in the paper version. And then you can see that in the footer, there's the ability to have additional information as well. And then in just the digital parts, you can see we'll have links to videos, hyperlinks to other resources should you want it, a clickable table of contents or other click-based navigation, tooltips. Those are the things when you hover over something and you can see more information, and the smartphone and tablet-based app to access to content, enhanced use of photos, launching additional information from images. I talked about that earlier. And then an ability to crowdsource information. So, for instance, the fact that if let's say we have a section on life cycle planning, and maybe there's a way on the digital portion for the users to upload a policy, a life cycle policy, if you feel that's something you want to share, or your pavement management and bridge management or other asset management manuals. So we're imagining that the digital version of the guide will help to keep the guide useful for a longer period than just the paper version, which is a snapshot in time. And so here's an example of a guide that we had done through NCHRP. It's a knowledge management guide, and you can, through the NCHRP project, you can download the PDF version of the guide itself, but then you can also have a web-based version where you can move around. So it gives you a kind of an example of a way how the digital and the paper views can work together. And another one, this is one that is a practitioner's handbook that AASHTO has through the Environmental Excellence Program. It's an index of PDF files, but just the fact that it's on the web makes it much easier to access specific elements of content that you want to go to. And this is kind of, I think this series is a combination of handbooks and has further links to additional information. So we want to ask you, I think this is our final question.
One more.
Oh, there's one more. Okay, so this is, how do you think you'll use the guidebook most? So we want you to pick one of the ways and to say, I'm sure you're going to use it in more ways. Actually, let's do it. I think you should pick two, because we all are going to probably use all of the ways at some point, but why don't you pick the two most ways that you're going to access the content of this guidebook? Very good. People are still, this is interesting results. All right, yeah, I think there are a few who may have still wanted, but I think this gives a good summary. So clearly, paper, PDF, and digital on computer. That's the way this group is going to access it, and a few, very small number on a tablet, and a slightly greater number on a smartphone. So thank you for that feedback. It helps us also think about, where we emphasize our efforts. The final one, and there's a poll with this one. So one of the things that the research panel asked for is, how include in this guide the kind of interface of new technologies that are happening and how it's going to interface with asset management. So, giving guidance on these things, that some of them futuristic, and it's overlay in an asset management program. So here's a list of new technologies that is going to clearly influence transportation. We think that these are all things that have an overlay with asset management, and so connected and autonomous vehicles, new assets due to technology advancements. We've already gone through a round of that with just the increase in the importance of operations in agencies, real-time traffic data, the use of mobile devices for data collection, software subscriptions as a way to manage all sorts of things in the way we do business, embedded intelligence in your assets themselves that are collecting information, for instance, the use of the cloud for data storage and sharing, and just a different form for how information is managed and accessed, 3D planning, design, and modeling, social media, the Internet of Things, kind of big data where you have our assets as well as other objects talking to each other and providing intelligent guidance and information, virtual reality. I think I was at the WashTo meeting back last June, and I think it was AutoCAD that had a booth where you could put on the virtual reality and walk through the city of Austin, Texas. AVLS, road weather information systems and maintenance decision support systems, kind of thinking of the way a much more integrated maintenance decision support system. So these are some of the ideas that are there, and our plan is to interface some of this in where it's appropriate and makes sense, where there's enough known so that we don't, we're not at risk of the information being stale before the document's printed. But let's move to the poll on this. Is, given all of these possibilities, which technology advancements are you most interested in including in the TAM Guide 3 because you think it's going to be important to you in the relatively near term that you somehow consider it in your asset management program? So here's the list. So we want you to pick your top 3 choices. So we're going to go through the same, how many screens? We're going to have 3 screens. So pick one from each screen, and then we'll summarize at the end. So here's the first set. So just pick one. We'll give it a couple more seconds here for you all to finish. So in this, it looks like, we're going to go through all of them. Yes, I forgot the protocol. So now this is the next set: embedded intelligence, the cloud, 3D plan, design and modeling, social media, Internet of Things / big data. So pick one from this. All right, and we'll move to the last poll. And here you have virtual and augmented reality, AVLS, RWIS and MARWIS, and the maintenance decision support system. And you have the opportunity here to click other and add some suggestions. All right. So let's look at the summaries. So in the first set, real-time traffic data came out with mobile devices for data collection. So kind of in the traffic world and mobile devices. All right, moving on to the next poll, the next set. And here, embedded intelligence and Internet of Things big data are the two that definitely pops out as more important than the others. And then on the final one, I think this one had the big preference, which was the maintenance decision support system. So I think that makes sense, given that that has such a strong relationship. All right, so thank you for that. So I think that, thank you for this participation. This is important. We're going to be having more of these sessions, not necessarily through this webinar series, but you'll be notified of them. Check the events calendar on the TAM portal, the project, when there's an open session for input, those will be posted. I think this interactive format helps us, and hopefully it also makes it more interesting for you. All right, and the final slide has to do with the upcoming webinars. So the next one is going to be in June, and it's going to be on life cycle planning and management. And I think given the importance of that topic area, as you guys have prioritized, I think it's a good one. All right, so that will be same time. If they're on Wednesday, the second Wednesday, or this one's going to be it's the second. Well, anyhow, so Wednesday at 2 p.m. And then we have two lined up after that, and that's in August after the TRB TAM conference, and it'll focus on some of the highlights from that conference. And then in October, we're going to do a webinar on integrating people's experiences with integrating the PM2 targets with their TAM 10-year targets, because by then those two will have been presented or submitted to Federal Highways. All right, so you had, let me just go through the questions. I was just going to jump off. All right, so let's go through some of the comments. So a comment from Ben Orsman on below is a list of plans, near plans, strategies, and processes that need to be closely coordinated to improve their value. The list may not have everything, but it's a good starting point. So the State Long Range Plan, the STIP, the TSMO plan, and Freight Plan, Asset Management Plan, and all of the various asset management components, the HSIP, the State Highway Safety Plan, Rail Plan, Airport Improvement Program. So yes, thank you, Ben. That's great input. And then Karen's comment is she likes both the how-to guides and the checklist. So given the interest in life cycle planning, it may be good to go make it longer, and whereas a topic like target setting may only need a shorter thing. So the input is we may want to vary the size of the length of the how-to guide. That's good input. So I think that's it on the input. So thank you, everybody. This has been good feedback, and I hope that you have a sense of the direction we're going with the TAM Guide 3, and please feel free to contact us if you have any further comments. But we hope you stay engaged with us as we're developing the guide, and so that you know what to anticipate, but you also provide us with input on how to shape it to meet your needs better. All right, thank you, and see you next time. Bye.